This is an 1887 census of my Dezent family from Jonava, Lithuania. David Dezent and Reza Kapul had 8 children: Esther, Dobra, Fega, Chana, Abram, Nisan, Shana, and Chasa. I've managed to trace descendants of most of the people on this list, and they ended up in different parts of the world and met wildly different fates. But learning about them was not an overnight process. This has been a years-long journey with many breakthroughs and discoveries, and probably more yet to come. I'm Yona Paley, and I believe genealogy is fun. And on today's episode, I'll be walking you step by step through how I have gone about tracing these 8 siblings from Jonava, Lithuania. The first of these siblings is my second great-grandmother, Chana Dezent. When I first began tracing my family, I talked to some relatives and they had known that my second great-grandfather was named Abraham Aronofsky and that his wife was named Anna. But that was pretty much all they knew about her. Not her last name, not anything. And it was from finding Abe and Anna's marriage certificate that I was able to find out that her parents were listed as being David Dezent and Rosie Kaplan. After that, it didn't take very long to find a 1900 census for Anna, slightly before she was married. And on that census, she's living with her sister, her older sister, Fanny Greenberg. Which brings us to our second sibling, Fega Dezent. Fega resided in New York City, and from her 1943 death record, once again those names, David Dezent and Rosie, or Rose, came back up. At this point, I still had no idea where the family came from. After all, most of the documents said that they were from Russia. And without any specifics on the town they came from, it was difficult for me to figure out, maybe what city they came from or whether it was in modern day Russia or just the Russian Empire. But I plucked up the courage to go on JewishGen and type in the last name Dezent, and after trying multiple variations on spelling, I managed to come across that 1887 census where I saw that there was a David Dezent living with a wife named Reza. And because I have a familiarity with anglicized versions of Jewish names, something struck a chord in me where I saw that there were 2 daughters, one named Chana and one named Fega. I knew that immigrants to the United States often change the name Chana to Anna, and that they often change the name Fega to Fanny. Moreover, when I saw that Reza's last name was Kapul, I wondered, could Reza be approximated in the English language as Rose or Rosie, and could Kapul have been simplified into a more common last name like Kaplan? I needed to find out more. There were a few extra Lithuanian records for some of these siblings, and I soon discovered that the youngest daughter, Chasa, had died at the age of 26 of pneumonia. Now, the next discovery was that of Nisan Dezent, the youngest son. I had recently started learning about how to trace families who were murdered in the Holocaust, and when I plugged the Dezent name into Yad Vashem, I found a page of testimony given for Nisan and his wife, who it turns out had moved to Vilnius, also in Lithuania, and sadly were murdered there around 1941. The page of testimony was given by his son David, and I quickly learned that David, along with his sister Shoshana, had survived the war and ended up in Israel. And in fact, they still have descendants living in Israel today. Around this time, I was also starting to get serious about the use of DNA for researching my ancestors. And I noticed that my great aunt had a big DNA match with someone named Melvin Paul. And while Melvin's profile didn't really have a huge amount of information about his family, I managed to create a tree for him, which I traced back on my own. And as it turns out, his grandmother was named Esther Dezent. Now, at first I wasn't 100% sure if this Esther was the same one as on the census, because her death record gave a different name other than David. And I thought maybe she was a cousin, is she necessarily the sibling? But what I did, because one thing you have to remember about death certificates is the information is provided by whoever is alive and close to the person. Sometimes the info being provided is not the most accurate. But what I've found to be slightly more accurate are gravestones. Because think about it. If you're gonna fork out thousands of dollars for a gravestone, you want to make sure that the information put on there is as correct as possible. So it's not a spur of the moment decision. And when I went to the website of the cemetery that Esther was buried at, it turns out that they provided a service where you could pay them like 10 or 15 bucks and get a photo of the gravestone. So I paid to get a photo of Esther's gravestone. And lo and behold, what did it say? Esther, daughter of David. Next came Abram Dezent. And this was an instance where public member trees ended up solving the riddle, because on Genie, I had added all the Dezents that I'd known of onto this big world tree. And I noticed that there was a profile for a granddaughter of Abram Dezent. And I reached out to them, and as it turns out, this was the same guy that was on this census. And sadly, like his brother Nisan, he was also murdered in the Holocaust. I was able to find his name on a Yizkor book, which is a book of remembrance for Jews living in various towns. And Abram had a bunch of kids. Most of them likely did not survive Europe, but one of them survived and ended up in Siberia and Russia and all sorts of different places. And then finally, they had descendants living in the United States who I came into contact with. And not only that, this person took a DNA test, verified that they were absolutely related in the exact way that we had figured out. Now, Shayna, I had marriage records of her in Lithuania where she married a guy named Isaac Buzak, but the trail ran completely cold after the birth of a couple of their children, and I was afraid that they were murdered in the Holocaust and that I would never be able to figure out what happened to them again. But this is an instance where being patient pays off in the long run, because going back to the DNA, lo and behold, just last week, a new DNA match popped up on my feed. And guess who it was? It was a descendant of Shayna Dezent, who had moved to Scotland, and the family had changed their last name from Buzak to Zach. She had changed her name to Jean, so she went under Jean Zach. And that is the story of Shayna Dezent. Now, there's one sibling still unaccounted for, and if you look at the original census, it says that Doba Dezent had died, but it doesn't list a year that she had died. And this was a little bit strange to me. Just the other week, I was looking through some old ship manifests, and I noticed that there was a Doba Dezent who had transited in Scotland and entered the United States in the 1890s. I haven't been able to discover what happened to this Doba or Dobra after she came to America, but it's someone that I'm keeping an eye out on because it's quite possible that she actually did survive Lithuania. So this just goes to show you that you can be tracing a family for years and years, find nothing, and then one day something just clicks, or a new DNA match pops up, or you find a new bit of information, and suddenly what you thought you knew about the fate of everyone completely changes. You're always going to have new findings. The more patient you are, and the more of these processes you set up in place to be able to learn these new discoveries when they happen. If I had not had the DNA of my aunt, if I had not learned about using public member trees, if I had not learned how to find ship manifests, none of this would have been possible. And that wraps up this video. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. As always, I'm looking forward to bringing you more videos about famous Jews, as well as tips and tricks that you can use in your own genealogy research. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.